Judith's true story from Nevada, when a mother-in-law finally says enough. There's a moment in every generous person's life when they realize their kindness has become someone else's expectation. And for Judith, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in March, standing in her own kitchen, reading a text message that made her hands shake. But to understand why that single message broke something inside her, you need to know who Judith was long before that day. You need to understand the kind of woman who spent 32 years building a life in a quiet Nevada suburb, raising her son alone, saving every dollar, and pouring her heart into being the kind of mother who never let her child feel the absence of a father. Because when her son married a woman who saw Judith not as family but as a financial resource, the grandmother who once gave everything found herself standing at a crossroads. She never imagined choosing between her peace and her son's marriage. Judith was 64 years old, a retired nurse living in Henderson, Nevada, in a house she had paid off with her own 2 hands. Her husband Daniel died of a heart attack when their son Marcus was only 7. One morning he was making breakfast, and by noon he was gone, just like that. Judith was 32, suddenly alone with a small boy who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. She never remarried, not because she didn't want love again, but because she made a choice, a quiet, fierce, deliberate choice that Marcus would never feel like he came second to anything or anyone. She worked double shifts at the hospital for nearly 2 decades. Christmas mornings when other nurses called in sick. Summer nights when the emergency room overflowed. She'd come home at 2 in the morning, check on Marcus sleeping, and sit at the kitchen table paying bills with a calculator and a yellow notepad. Every dollar had a purpose. Every sacrifice had a name, and that name was her son. She built a retirement fund not through luck or inheritance, but through discipline that most people couldn't sustain for a year, let alone 20. Her entire identity was wrapped in one simple truth: she was a good mother. She had to be. She was all Marcus had. And Marcus, he grew into exactly the kind of man that makes a mother's heart swell. A quiet, kind boy who became a respectful young man. He never gave her trouble, never ran with the wrong crowd. He studied hard, said please and thank you, and looked people in the eye when he spoke. Judith's pride in him was bone deep. He went to college on a partial scholarship, and she covered the rest without hesitation. She didn't tell him how many extra shifts it cost. She just smiled at his graduation and thought, this is what it was all for. Marcus became an engineer. He got a good job, a steady life, and their relationship stayed close weekly dinners at her kitchen table. Phone calls every other day, the kind of bond that made other mothers envious. Judith felt her sacrifices had paid off in full. Then Marcus met Kendra. He was 28 at a work function, and Kendra was everything that caught the eye: charming, outgoing, ambitious, with a laugh that filled a room. Marcus was smitten. Judith could see it in the way he talked about her, the way his voice lifted when he said her name. And Judith wanted to be happy. She truly did. But she noticed small things early. The way Kendra talked about money with a casual entitlement, as if having nice things wasn't a privilege but a baseline. The designer bags that appeared on every visit. The way Kendra's eyes swept across Judith's modest living room with something that wasn't quite judgment, but wasn't quite respect either. Once, Kendra mentioned how cozy the house was, and the word landed like a stone wrapped in silk. Judith dismissed these things. She told herself it was a generational difference. Young women today had different expectations. She wanted to like her son's choice, and so she made herself like her. She opened her arms, her home, and eventually her wallet. When Marcus and Kendra got engaged, Judith offered $15,000 toward the wedding. Nobody asked her for it. She offered freely, joyfully, because this was her only son's happiness, and she wanted to be part of it. Kendra's thank you came in a brief text, no phone call, no card, just a few words on a screen. Judith noticed, but she let it pass. Within months of the marriage, the dynamic began to shift in ways that felt subtle at first, and then unmistakable. Calls from Marcus became less frequent. Weekly dinners turned into every other week, then once a month. When Marcus did call, the conversations felt shorter, more distracted, and increasingly, they ended with a request, a small loan here, help with a bill there, always framed as temporary, always delivered in Marcus's uncomfortable voice, as if he was reading from a script someone else had written. For the first 2 years of the marriage, Judith told herself that every family goes through adjustments, that Kendra was simply young and still learning. But what came next wasn't a learning curve. It was a pattern. It was 6 months after the wedding when the first real ask came. Not from Marcus, from Kendra herself. She called Judith on a Tuesday evening, her voice bright and animated, talking about a business opportunity she'd found. Something about an online retail venture, a friend who was already making great money doing it. She needed $5,000 to get started. She said it casually, as though she were asking to borrow a cup of sugar. Judith paused. $5,000 was not a small amount, not even for someone who had managed her finances carefully her whole life. But Kendra sounded so hopeful, so full of energy, and Judith thought, this is what family does. You invest in each other. You believe in each other. She transferred the money the next day. Months passed. No business appeared, no website, no product, no mention of it at Sunday dinners. When Judith finally brought it up one evening, gently, carefully, the way you might ask about a sore subject, Kendra's face tightened. She said it hadn't worked out, that the timing wasn't right, that maybe Judith didn't understand how these things worked. Marcus pulled his mother aside later that night and said, quietly, "Just let it go, Mom." So Judith let it go, but she didn't forget. Over the next 2 years, the requests multiplied. A car down payment because Kendra's old sedan wasn't safe enough. Money for a vacation to Mexico because they were both so stressed and Marcus really needed the break. Contributions toward renovating the kitchen, then the bathroom, then the backyard. Each request came wrapped in reasonable language. It was temporary. It was necessary. It was an investment in the family's future. Kendra had a gift for framing things so that saying no felt selfish. And Marcus always stood slightly behind her, nodding along, never quite meeting his mother's eyes. Judith kept a mental tally. She couldn't help it. By the end of those 2 years, she had given them over $40,000 beyond what she'd already contributed for the wedding. $40,000 from a retired woman living on savings and a modest pension. She never said the number out loud, but she knew it. She felt it every time she checked her account balance. The emotional manipulation was perhaps worse than the financial drain. When Judith hesitated, and she did begin to hesitate, Kendra had a repertoire of tactics that landed with surgical precision. She'd mention how hard Marcus works, how exhausted he was, implying that Judith's money could ease his burden if only she cared enough. She'd say things like, My friend's mother-in-law just bought them a new refrigerator without them even asking. That's what real family does. She'd bring up Judith's house, her savings, her modest comforts, as though the mere act of having something meant you were obligated to give it away. And if none of that worked, if Judith actually said no, the silence would come, weeks without a phone call, texts that went unanswered, Marcus suddenly too busy to talk. Then Lily was born, Judith's first grandchild, a tiny girl with Marcus's dark eyes and a grip that could hold your whole heart. Judith loved her immediately, completely, in that way that grandparents do, with all the tenderness of parenthood, but none of the exhaustion. She wanted to be present for every milestone, every smile, every clumsy first step. Kendra understood this, and she used it. When Judith was generous, the visits flowed easily. Come over anytime, stay for dinner, take Lily for the afternoon. But when Judith pushed back on a request, when she said maybe not this month, or asked what happened to the last amount she'd given, suddenly Lily was too fussy for visitors, or they had plans, or Kendra wasn't feeling well and couldn't handle company. The message was never spoken directly, but it was perfectly clear. Access to your granddaughter has a price. Judith felt trapped in a way she'd never experienced before. Her principles told her to stop. Her heart told her that if she stopped, she'd lose Lily. She'd lose Marcus. She'd lose everything she had left of her family. And Marcus said nothing. That was perhaps the deepest wound of all. He never directly asked his mother for money. He kept his hands technically clean. But he never stopped Kendra either. He never said, "That's enough. Leave my mother alone." When Judith tried to speak with him privately, tried to reach the boy, who used to tell her everything, he'd deflect. "She means well, Mom. You're overthinking it. It's not that serious." He'd become a stranger wearing her son's face, and Judith grieved for him even as he stood right in front of her. Judith spent nearly 3 years in this cycle, giving, doubting herself, giving again. She lost sleep. She lost weight. She started to feel like an ATM with a heartbeat, useful only for what she could dispense. And then came the demand that changed everything. It came on a Tuesday in March, not as a phone call, not as a face-to-face conversation over coffee, not even as a handwritten note slipped under the door. It came as a text message, a long, cold, meticulously worded text message from Kendra, and the moment Judith read it, something inside her shifted permanently. $20,000. That was the number. $20,000 for a kitchen renovation. And the language Kendra used, it wasn't a question. It wasn't wrapped in courtesy or softened by gratitude. It read like an invoice. "We need this by the end of the month. Marcus said you have it in savings. It's for Lily's benefit too, since she needs a proper home. No please, no thank you for everything you've already done. No acknowledgement that Judith had spent decades earning every cent in that savings account through labor that broke her body down one shift at a time. Just a number and a deadline, as though Judith existed solely to fund whatever vision Kendra had for her life. Judith's hands began to shake as she held her phone, and here's the thing, it wasn't anger. Not at first. It was something worse. It was the sudden, nauseating clarity of seeing yourself through someone else's eyes and realizing they don't see a person at all. They see a resource. Kendra hadn't even deemed this request worthy of a real conversation. $20,000, a sum that represented months of double shifts, years of careful saving, the security blanket Judith had woven for herself after Daniel's death, and it warranted nothing more than a text message. That's what Judith was worth to her daughter-in-law. Not even a phone call. She set the phone down on her kitchen table and sat there for an hour. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She just sat in the silence of the house she'd paid for with her own two hands and thought about Daniel. She thought about the way he used to say, "We're building something, Judy. Every extra shift, every dollar saved, it's all going somewhere." She thought about the retirement fund she'd built so carefully, one deposit at a time, like a woman stacking bricks to build a wall between herself and poverty. And she thought about how casually Kendra had just asked her to tear that wall down. That evening, Judith called her older sister, Carol. Carol lived 2 hours away in Reno and had been watching this situation unfold with the kind of quiet, simmering frustration that only a sibling can carry. She'd bitten her tongue for years. She'd watched Judith shrink. She'd seen the way her sister's voice got smaller every time she talked about Marcus and Kendra. But when Judith told her about the text, Carol didn't hold back. "Judy, when did you start letting someone else's wife treat you like a bank?" Carol's voice was steady but sharp. "You didn't raise Marcus to be a man who lets his mother be used. And if that's who he's become, that's not your fault, but it's not your burden either. You hear me? You carried that boy on your back for 18 years. You don't owe his wife your retirement." Those words landed somewhere deep in Judith's chest, in the place where she'd been burying her own instincts for 3 years. Carol said out loud what Judith had been too afraid to even think, and once those words were spoken, they couldn't be unspoken. Over the following week, Judith did not respond to Kendra's text. The silence was deliberate. Instead, she did something she hadn't done since Daniel died. She opened a journal, and in that journal, she began to write. She listed every dollar she had given Marcus and Kendra over the past 3 years. She listed every holiday she'd been excluded from. Every time a visit with Lily was dangled like a reward for compliance and then snatched away as punishment for hesitation. Every time Marcus had chosen silence over his mother, the numbers alone were staggering tens of thousands of dollars that had purchased nothing, no closeness, no respect, no gratitude. Her generosity hadn't brought her closer to her son. It had funded the distance between them. Every check she wrote bought Kendra another reason to see her as useful, and another reason to never see her as family. When Judith finally responded, she did not text Kendra back. She called Marcus, her son, the boy she'd rocked to sleep, the teenager she'd driven to baseball practice, the young man she'd watched marry a woman who would eventually try to drain her dry. She called him, and when he answered, she spoke with a calm that surprised even herself. "I love you more than anything in this world," she said, "but I will not give another dollar to someone who treats me like an obligation rather than a person. If that means I lose access to you and Lily, then that's the price of my dignity, and you need to decide what kind of man you want to be." Marcus was quiet on the other end. Judith waited. She gave him space to say something, anything that might tell her. The son she raised was still in there somewhere. But what followed that phone call was not the reconciliation Judith had quietly hoped for. It was silence, the kind of silence that fills a house and makes the walls feel closer together. 3 weeks passed before Marcus called back. 3 weeks of silence that felt like 3 years. And when his name finally appeared on her phone screen, Judith's heart leaped, then sank the moment she heard his voice. It was stiff, rehearsed, like someone reading from a script they didn't write themselves. He told her that Kendra was hurt, that she felt disrespected. He asked his mother, the woman who had given him everything, who had never once in his life asked him for anything she didn't need, to just apologize so they could all move past this. Judith said no. The call lasted 4 minutes. It was the shortest conversation she had ever had with her only son, and then the grief came, not all at once, but in waves unpredictable and unrelenting. She grieved not just the relationship as it currently was, but the relationship she had always imagined she would have in her later years. The Sunday morning breakfasts she used to make for Marcus and little Lily, the sound of small feet running down her hallway, the warmth of a kitchen full of people she loved. Now her kitchen was quiet. The table sat with one placemat where there used to be 3. She cried in private, in the shower, in her car after grocery shopping. At 2 in the morning, when doubt crept in like a cold draft under the door. Did I go too far? Should I have just paid the money and kept the peace? But every morning, when daylight returned and clarity came with it, Judith chose her boundary again. Not because it was easy, because it was right. The community around her split like a cracked mirror. In her church group, some women squeezed her hand and told her she was brave. Others, mostly those who had never had someone reach into their wallet, with entitled fingers, called her stubborn. They said things like family is family and you only get one son, as though Judith didn't already know that, as though the weight of that truth wasn't something she carried every single hour of every single day. She learned quickly who her real support system was. Her sister Carol, who called every evening just to check in. Her old friend Diane from her nursing days, who drove 40 minutes just to sit on Judith's porch and drink coffee in comfortable silence. And her pastor, a quiet man with kind eyes, who told her something she would never forget. He said that boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are love's guardrails. They keep everyone from driving off the edge. When the money stopped flowing, Kendra's behavior shifted. The demands turned into something uglier, something vindictive. She began posting on social media, vague but pointed messages about toxic in-laws and people who abandon family when things get hard. She told mutual acquaintances that Judith was selfish, controlling, manipulative. She painted a picture of a bitter old woman withholding love out of spite, a picture that looked nothing like the real Judith, but that stuck in the minds of people who didn't know any better. And then came the final message. One single text that arrived on a Tuesday evening while Judith was watering her garden. It read, "You'll regret this when you're old and alone." Judith read it once. She stood very still for a long moment, feeling the words try to burrow under her skin. Then she blocked the number, not out of anger, out of self-preservation. 6 months passed, half a year of near silence. Judith received a few short texts from Marcus' birthday wishes, written in that careful, distant tone. A photo of Lily on her first day of preschool, standing in a yellow dress with a backpack almost bigger than she was. Judith responded warmly each time. She told him she loved him. She told Lily she looked beautiful. But she didn't chase. She didn't beg. She didn't ask when she could see them or whether things had changed. She was learning something she never thought she would have to learn at 63 years old, how to love her son from a distance, how to hold someone in her heart without holding on to them with desperate hands. Those months were not empty, though they were quiet. Judith read more than she had in years. She walked every morning along the trail near her house. She began volunteering at a local food bank on Saturdays, finding purpose in feeding strangers since she could no longer feed her own family. She was not flourishing, that would be a lie, but she was surviving, and some seasons of life, survival is enough. But silence, uncomfortable as it is, sometimes does what conversation cannot. It creates space for reflection, for honesty, for the slow and painful work of seeing clearly. And then, on a Friday evening 9 months after the silence began, Judith's phone rang. She almost didn't answer. When she picked up, Marcus's voice was different, quieter, heavier, like a man carrying something he had only just realized he'd been holding for years. He told her things with Kendra weren't good. Not just about money, he said, but about how she treats people. How she spoke about his mother when she thought he wasn't paying attention. And then Marcus said something that split Judith's chest wide open. "I think I've been a coward, Mom." He didn't apologize directly, but those 5 words carried more weight than any grand gesture could have, because it meant he was seeing. Finally, slowly, painfully he was seeing. Judith did not rush back in. She did not offer to help with bills or suggest solutions for his marriage. She told him she loved him. She told him she would always be his mother. But she also told him, gently and without cruelty, that things could not return to what they had been before. The old arrangement was gone, not because she didn't love him, but because she loved herself enough now to refuse what had been hurting her. She set clear terms, not as punishment, but as protection. She would have a relationship with Marcus and with Lily, but she would not fund their lifestyle. She would not tolerate disrespect from Kendra, and if Kendra ever wanted to rebuild something with Judith, it would need to come through consistent, genuine respect, not a single apology offered to unlock a checkbook. Marcus accepted this quietly, without argument, and that acceptance told Judith how much had shifted inside her son. Over the months that followed, Judith learned pieces of what was happening in their home, without her financial cushion absorbing the impact of overspending. The cracks became impossible to ignore. Credit card statements sparked fights. Kendra's habits, the ones Marcus had once defended, now pressed directly against his own peace. He began to see what Judith had seen for years, a pattern of entitlement dressed up as expectation, a way of treating generosity not as a gift but as a debt owed. Marcus started therapy. Judith never asked him to, never suggested it, but when he told her, she felt something close to pride, not because therapy meant he was broken, but because it meant he was brave enough to look at himself honestly. And then there was Lily. Every other Saturday, Marcus would bring her to Judith's house. They baked cookies together, Lily standing on a step stool with flour in her hair. They read picture books on the porch swing. They sat in the garden watching ladybugs, while Lily narrated their adventures in her small, serious voice. Judith had to resist the urge to overgive, to buy toys, to spoil Lily with everything she had missed. But she understood now that the impulse to give extravagantly was sometimes just another form of fear. So instead, she gave Lily presents, attention. The quiet, steady certainty of a grandmother who would always be there because of who she was, not what she could provide. Kendra never apologized, not once. As of the time Judith shared this story, Marcus and Kendra were still married, still in counseling, still navigating whatever tangled thing their relationship had become. Judith made peace peace with the possibility that a full apology might never come, that the relationship with her daughter-in-law might never be more than civil distance. And she was okay with that, because her boundary was never about getting a specific outcome. It was never about forcing Kendra to change or making Marcus choose sides. It was about reclaiming herself, her dignity, her peace, her right to exist without being treated as a resource to be managed and extracted from. Judith's story doesn't end with a neat bow. Real life rarely does. But what she learned in those painful months carries a kind of wisdom that only comes from walking through fire and choosing not to burn yourself down to keep someone else warm. So what does Judith's story actually teach us? Not in the abstract, not as some tidy parable, but as lived truth, earned through months of sleepless nights and a silence so loud it nearly broke her. The first lesson is one that every generous person eventually confronts, though most of us learn it far too late. Generosity without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Judith gave freely for years, her money, her time, her emotional energy, her weekends, her retirement savings. She gave because she loved her son, because she adored her granddaughter, because she believed that family meant showing up with open hands no matter what. But somewhere along the way, her giving stopped being received as a gift. It became expected. It became demanded. And the moment your generosity is no longer met with gratitude, but with entitlement, the moment someone responds to your kindness not with "thank you," but with "is that all?" it has stopped being generosity. It has become a tax, and no one should pay taxes to people who offer nothing in return but contempt. Recognizing this distinction is not selfish, it is not cold, it is survival, because a river that gives all its water away doesn't become noble. It simply dries up, and Judith was drying up. The second lesson cuts deeper, and it's the one that hurt Judith most. Silence from someone you love is not neutrality, it is a choice. Marcus didn't yell at his mother. He didn't write cruel emails or make demands himself. He simply said nothing. He let Kendra do the asking, the pressuring, the guilting, and he stood behind her like a shadow, neither defending nor attacking. But that silence was not innocence. When we stay quiet while someone we love is being exploited, we are not remaining neutral. We are siding with the person doing the harm. Every time Marcus heard Kendra dismiss his mother's feelings and said nothing, he made a choice. Every time he watched Judith hand over money she couldn't afford and didn't speak up, he chose comfort over courage. Judith's story asks us to look honestly at our own lives. Where are we staying silent? Where is our refusal to speak costing someone their dignity? Neutrality in the face of mistreatment is not peace. It is participation. The third lesson is perhaps the most painful, because it acknowledges a cost that no one wants to pay. Boundaries may cost you relationships, but they will save your self-respect. When Judith stopped sending money, stopped answering demands, stopped accepting the role of family ATM, she lost access to Marcus and Lily for months without hearing her granddaughter's voice, months without knowing if her son still thought of her. That was real loss, real grief. She doesn't minimize it, and neither should we. But here is what she gained. She stopped waking at 2 a.m. with her stomach in knots. She stopped flinching when her phone rang. She stopped measuring her own worth in dollar signs and favors granted. The trade was brutal presence for peace, access for dignity. But it was honest, and honest pain, the kind that comes from standing up for yourself even when it costs you. That pain heals. It scars over and becomes something you can live with. Resentment never does. Resentment just rots you from the inside, so slowly you don't notice until there's nothing left. The fourth lesson arrived when Marcus finally came back. And it may be the hardest one of all. Reconciliation does not require returning to the old dynamic. When Marcus reached out, when those first tentative conversations began, Judith did not reopen the bank of mom. She did not pretend the months of silence hadn't happened, did not wave away the hurt. With "Isn't it wonderful? We're all together again." She rebuilt from a new foundation, one with clear terms, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding that love and access are not transactional. You can love someone fully and still have limits. You can welcome someone back without handing them the keys to the same room they destroyed. Restored relationships do not mean restored patterns. That distinction is everything. And finally, there are Judith's own words, written in a letter she shared with her church support group, months after the worst of it had passed. She wrote, "I spent my whole life thinking that being a good mother meant never saying no, that love meant absorbing whatever was thrown at me with a smile. But I have learned that the strongest thing a mother can do is show her child, even her adult child, that she values herself. Because if I don't teach Marcus that women deserve respect and dignity, who will? And if I don't show Lily that a woman can be loving and still have limits, what am I really leaving her?" Those words carry the weight of everything Judith walked through. The story closes with her, reflecting on the painful but necessary boundary she drew, acknowledging that love sometimes means letting go and offering quiet wisdom to others who find themselves being exploited by the people they welcomed into their family. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the calm clarity of someone who finally understands that protecting yourself is not a betrayal of love. It is love's deepest expression turned, at last, inward.